This lecture is part of the class History 363 Modern Africa. I'm Dr. Young. Welcome back. Um, so our topic for this time is Islam, specifically Islam in North Africa. But I want to talk about the historical legacy of Islam in Africa. Large parts of the continent became Muslim over the centuries, and this was a major factor in the culture of North Africa, much of West Africa, and much of the East African coast. Historically, Africa has been far more Muslim than Christian. In recent times, largely due to European incursions, large swaths of Africa have become Christian in religious identity. But historically, really the only areas that have persisted as Christians for many centuries is Ethiopia. There was some Christianity, of course, in North Africa in late antiquity before the rise of Islam, but much of that was swept aside by the Islamic conquests in the 7th and 8th centuries. And so all of this region that you see on the map here in green these are the areas that are traditionally Muslim, and much of that remains Muslim all the way till the present. Islam dominated much of the long-distance trade in Africa for many centuries, really up until recent times, up until the late 18th century, I suppose with the exception of the transatlantic slave trade. They dominated all of the major trade routes. The trade routes across the Sahara Desert. That desert, as I've said in a previous lecture, was like an ocean. It took specialized knowledge to be able to cross the Sahara, but it was also potentially lucrative. This is what tied North Africa, the area up here, to West Africa, was this trans-Saharan trade, and Islam spread along those trade routes. We've also talked about Islam, down the East African coast, down the Swahili coast, as it's known after the predominant language spoken in that area. And so these parts of Africa have all been Muslim, really, for many centuries, for over a millennium at this point. Even in places that are predominantly Christian, like Ethiopia, there have been major segments of the population that have been converted to Islam, and that has produced a great deal of conflict there. With the spread of Islam militarily came the process of Islamization, and this is a long process of cultural change. It didn't happen the same way everywhere. There were different factors at different times. North Africa, Egypt, Libya, or what is now Libya. Let me put out some geographic terms here that I'm going to be using just to make sure we're clear on these. This whole region up here of North Africa is collectively referred to as the Maghreb. You'll see that term used in the textbook. There's also a term that I may use, which is the Fezzan, which is this region down here, kind of southwestern Libya, the Sahara region, north of, kind of north of Lake Chad here. This whole area is called the Fezzan. And so, anyway, these are geographic terms. But across the Fezzan and across the Maghreb, including Egypt, and then all the way into Spain, these places came to be ruled by Muslims over the course of the 7th and 8th century, and these Muslim rulers were largely Arab. They came out of the Arabian Peninsula and established themselves there as a ruling elite. But over the course of the centuries, the people who were ruled by these Arabs who had migrated into North Africa became Muslim and even took up the Arabic language, such that the distinctions that existed in the early couple of centuries of Islam between Arabs and non-Arabs gradually disappeared. Maybe not entirely in every case, but pretty much everyone came over time to speak Arabic and to have a Muslim identity rather than an Arab identity, as Islam became more egalitarian. There are a few features of Islam that we should note. For one, there is no separation between religious and secular authority in Islam, or at least historically there has not been. dating back to the time of Muhammad, the religious leader was always the political leader. And such things as law and political systems were seen as extensions of religious duties, and it was the responsibility of the political leader to ensure that people were living by the strictures of the Islamic religion, by imposing an Islamic-based legal system known, traditionally as Sharia law. That's the Arabic term for it. And so we expect to find in Islamic societies a very close relationship between the religion and the political authority, and that was true in these Islamized parts of Africa for many centuries. However, in the modern era, largely under pressure from Europeans, there were some Muslim leaders who took up the effort to modernize, and by modernize, that really means to become more like Europe. And this was not met with approval everywhere. In fact, there was a great deal of pushback against this, seeing these modernizing tendencies as an offense to the predominant religion. And so it's out of this context, with the threat of modernity to some extent, that we see the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. And this North Africa is one of the centers of that in the 18th and 19th centuries. In the Arabian Peninsula, with the backing of a very powerful family with the name Saud, and this is the origins of the Saudi dynasty that continues to rule Saudi Arabia all the way to the present. But there was a brotherhood of Islamic clerics, Islamic scholars, called after the founder, whose name was Al-Wahhab. This is known as the Wahhabi movement, and it was one of the leading proponents of Islamic revivalism. There was also a similar kind of brotherhood in North Africa in the 19th century, called the Sanusiya Brotherhood, after the founder, whose name was Sanusi, Muhammad al-Sanusi. And this would prove to be a very strong organization, a very strong kind of crystallizing organization for those who opposed modernization and westernization in the Muslim world. And so the impact of fundamentalism was pretty profound. The other thing we should say, the other feature of Islam that I forgot to mention, well, there are really two. One is that Islam does not have, traditionally, a really strong clerical element to it. And this is mostly because the religious and the secular authorities are one and the same, that government officials would oversee the upkeep of the religion. But in much of Islam, there isn't a strong clerical element. There are, in various parts of Islam, people who hold special religious status, usually on the basis of scholarship, or on the basis of closeness to God, and that's a very vague way to describe it. But let me refer to a couple of specific terms. So, for instance, in parts of Islam, and this includes North Africa, there was a group of scholars known as the ulama, who were really the interpreters of law. Then there were also prayer leaders, and to some extent the kind of theological monitors of Islamic society, and these were known in some places as the imams. But then in Islam, just as in Christianity and Judaism, over the course of the centuries, there developed a mystical strain to this, and this is less of a kind of bookish approach to Islam and more of an ecstatic experience approach, where people would try to achieve closeness with God by prayer and meditation, and in some cases even things like exercising or dancing or reciting poetry. Anyway, this isn't the place to go into Islamic mysticism or mysticism in general here. But these Sufis who formed brotherhoods were often the kind of monitors of the religious experience, and the ones who spurred people to greater heights of piety, and they were a persistent element in African Islam, at least in parts of African Islam. The other feature of Islam that we should mention here is that there was a division in Islam between two main groups, and this conflict extends all the way back to the 7th century, to the fight between Ali, who was the closest male relative of Muhammad after Muhammad's death. This was his son-in-law and his nephew. Ali tried to lay claim to the title of Caliph, the successor to Muhammad. He didn't succeed initially, but there were those who supported him, believing that because he was so closely related to Muhammad, that the leadership of the Muslim community ought to pass to him. He became the 4th caliph, but then he was assassinated, and all these supporters blamed the man who took power after him and defeated Ali's sons in battle. This was Muawiyah, the founder of the Umayyad dynasty, and this prompted a split between those who were supporters of Ali and those who kind of went along with the mainstream, and the mainstream Muslims came to be known as the Sunni. Those who split and those who were supporters of Ali and the kind of the bloodline argument that leadership should pass through the bloodline of the family of Muhammad became known as Shiites. And because the Shiites were a minority and were often persecuted within Islam, they developed much has happened in Judaism in ancient times. They developed this notion that God would send a deliverer, would send a Messiah-like figure, and this person was known as the Mahdi. Now, this prevailed in Shiism for the most part, but it diffused from there into Sunni Islam, and this will play a role in parts of African Islam, as we'll see. There are those who lay claim to the title of Mahdi in Africa, and even with that claim are able to put together significant followings and even take over and establish hegemony over parts of Africa. Now, this is also the time where I want to introduce Western imperialism as a concept, because we're going to see in this lecture some of the instances where European countries begin to take over parts of Africa. And not all of these instances of Europeans taking over parts of Africa were the same. They operated under different rules with different conceptions about what Europeans were doing there. And so it's important for us to point out that there is a kind of spectrum of Western imperialism, from the most invasive to the least invasive. The most invasive is what we call annexation. This is where the European country simply annexes a part of whatever colonial possession they are attempting to do this with. In our discussion, of course, is all going to be about Africa, but I may refer in talking about imperialism and colonialism to other parts of the world too, where they simply annex another place and make it part of their country. The best example of this is Algeria, at least the northern coast of Algeria, which was taken over by France and simply annexed to become part of France. And if that still isn't clear, this would be like the United States taking possession of Alaska or Hawaii, and then incorporating it into their country and eventually making it a fundamental part of the U.S. I mean, really, the U.S. did annex in some ways both of those places, though the language that language may not have been used in that way. Well, in 1830, as we're going to see, France annexed Algeria and made it part of France. The second most invasive and one of the more common, annexation was not very common, but one of the more common forms of imperialism is what we call a colony. This is where the European power takes over a country and establishes a government there, and a centralized government, and often a military and a police to keep the peace and to make sure that people are obeying the colonial power. They do co-opt local authorities and work together with the local authorities, but the central government is in the hands of the European power, as is the military and the police. The best example of a colony probably is British India, but there are several colonies, as we're going to see, in Africa as well, operating under those kinds of terms. Also with a colony, as with an annexation, you often get a fairly high level of European settlement, where people actually leave Europe and go off to the colony and live there for either brief or lengthy periods of time, in many cases actually settling there, and this settlement is encouraged by the European power. That was especially the case with the annexation of Algeria, because this was part of France, and this was thought to relieve the excess pressure on the rural setting. If you ship a few of the peasant farmers off to Algeria and give them claims to farms there, that this will help to unburden some of the people in the countryside who are quite poor. The third colonial situation or imperial situation is what we call a protectorate. This is where the European power leaves in place the central government or the regional government of an area, often leaving in place people who have the title of king or pasha or something like that, but then effectively govern the territory through a kind of shadow government, where they send European advisors, but it's really the advisors making all of the decisions. Military and police and technically political control are all in the hands of the local or regional authorities in this case, but the decisions are being made by Europeans. And then the least invasive is simply what we call a sphere of influence. This is a situation where the European power will have a presence in an area, mostly for economic reasons. Some good examples would be, places where the British or the French needed to have a stop for their steamships so that they could fill up with coal and supplies and continue with their ocean voyages, either naval ships or merchant ships. The southern part of the Arabian Peninsula was, for instance, a British sphere of influence, as were parts of the West African coast for a time. Now, there are times when something might, be a sphere of influence for a while and eventually become a protectorate or a colony or something like that. And we saw in the last lecture that the British were involved in parts of South Africa, and due to the threat of the Afrikaner republics, they eventually turned these into colonies. So we could say that KwaZulu-Natal was for a time a sphere of influence, but then it became a colony, or at least Natal did. I forgot to mention that the chief example of a protectorate in Africa, at least, was Egypt in the late 19th century, which was really being ruled by the British, though they continued to keep in place the central government under the various men who held usually the title of Pasha there. Finally, the last thing we should say generally about Islam in Africa is that this period of the 19th century sees a tremendous battle, conceptually, ideologically, and even outright militarily at times, between traditional Muslims, those who looked to the early days of Islam as the model for behavior, the model for government, the model for law, and this, the authority of these were often ensconced in these scholarly brotherhoods who pronounced on points of Islamic law. In Cairo, there was a very famous mosque called the Al-Azhar Mosque, for instance, which was very much a center of traditionalist and revivalist thinking. And then the secularists, those who wanted to divorce the Muslim religion from the ruling of these countries. And I would say that most people probably were in the traditionalist camp. I mean, the vast majority of Africans were living a very traditional, Africans in Muslim regions were living a traditional Muslim lifestyle, and to them and to those who were their religious leaders, the efforts of these secularist figures amounted to heresy within Islam. And so, we really see a battle for the soul of Islam in this period, and in particular Islam in Africa. Going back into all the way to the 16th century, the dominant empire over much of, sorry for the yawn, much of North Africa and many of the parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, down the Red Sea coast on both sides, all the way down to the Persian Gulf, was the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottomans had, for instance, conquered Egypt in 1517 and made it part of their empire, and then they had extended their authority all the way across North Africa into these regions known as Cyrenaica and Tunis and Algiers. These are important cities on the northern coast of Africa. So the date actually back to ancient times. Tunis was ancient Carthage, and Cyrenaica was ancient Cyrene, which was a Greek colony, and Algiers had been around for a really long time. Well, these became technically part of the Ottoman Empire. And in the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire was probably the most powerful kingdom in the world. The last of the great land-based empires, that is, empires based on control of a lot of land and the ability to tax peasant farmers. The Ottomans had spread into Europe and even besieged Vienna in the early 17th century, knocking on the door of Central and even Western Europe by doing that. They had, in the 15th century, they defeated the last vestiges of the Byzantine Empire and had taken over the Balkan Peninsula here, stretching all the way up into, what is now Hungary and Austria. They'd fought against a coalition of Western European powers at Vienna. One of the secrets of their success was that they had a system of taxation whereby they demanded young men from their Christian subjects in the Balkans who were then taken, this is a tax, they became the possession of the Ottoman state, of the Sultan, and they were taken, converted to Islam, and turned into the most fearsome warrior society in the world at the time, the so-called Janissary Corps of soldiers. And these Janissaries had won a series of smashing victories. This is one of the keys to the success of the expansion and the strength of the Ottoman Empire in the 17th century. But over time, the Janissaries ceased to be so effective. In many cases, they became more interested in pursuing wealth than in continuing with their military discipline. Even got involved in government corruption and things like this, and so this undermined the authority of the Ottomans. And by the end of the 17th century, the early 18th century, parts of the Ottoman Empire, although they remained technically part of the empire, broke away and became independent. And this was the case for most of these regions in North Africa. Egypt, Cyrenaica, Tunis, and Algiers were technically Ottoman subjects, but the powerful noble families, and in some cases the Turks or the Balkan peoples who had been sent to rule over these areas as direct agents of the Ottoman Empire, came to act in autonomous or semi-autonomous ways. Again, while technically giving assent to the Sultan in Istanbul as their lord, they ran their own show. And that's the situation that we encounter at the beginning of the 19th century. A lot of regional autonomy under the leadership of these powerful individuals. In Egypt, for instance, the noble families who dated back to the old military aristocracy known as the Mamluks, which dates all the way back to like the 10th century. So this is a very traditional, very long-lived system of aristocracy. And they came to have the title Bey, which is a common title in use all across North Africa, as we're going to see. The Turks, or the Balkan peoples who were sent to act as direct governors, were often took the title of Pasha. And in some cases, they even whip out old Persian titles or old Arabic titles for themselves. But Egypt, under the reign of these Mamluks, although it was not necessarily centralized, was really quite effective and spread Ottoman influence well south of Egypt, down the Red Sea coast. Ottoman expansion was fueled in this goes back to like the 17th century, but when the Ottomans were really quite powerful, it was fueled by Portuguese expansion, as we've seen, into Africa, and so they seized the port of Massawa in the 17th century. But then, as we said, in the 18th century, many of these areas broke away. The Mamluk aristocracy and the beys and pashas of Egypt becoming more autonomous, acting in more independent ways. Now, this is similar in Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. There were also people there called beys, or in the case of Algiers, the Deys, D-E-Y-S. In fact, this image you see on the slide is an illustration drawn in the 19th century of one of the Deys of Algiers meeting with what is either, I think this is actually an American ship. One of the reasons the U.S. began to build a navy in the early 19th century was that the beys and Deys of North Africa, the beys of Tunis and the beys of Egypt, and the Deys of Algiers were sponsors of a great deal of piracy from which they profited, and so the Europeans were often trying desperately to influence these people to stop piracy, and this is one of the reasons that the Europeans concoct for invading these parts of Africa. The beys of Algiers became very wealthy and very influential, largely because they controlled the trans-Saharan trade, which was still very lucrative. The flow of gold and slaves and salt and other valuable commodities across the Sahara enriched these people quite a bit. And so they were able to buy large militaries, or at least well-trained militaries, and set up these kind of military governments under the leadership of the beys or the Deys. The one area of North Africa, Muslim North Africa, that was never part of the Ottoman Empire was Morocco, under the leadership of men who took the title Sultan, which was a Turkish title. This is sort of ironic that they were never Ottoman. But the sultans, the most powerful of all the sultans, dates back to the 16th century. Ahmad al-Mansur, who, with his Berber mounted cavalry, his horsemen, and his elite military units, was able to go all the way down into West Africa and even conquer the Songhai Empire, which is one of the largest of the empires of the Sahel region in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period. And so Morocco had a great deal of authority earlier in its history, and it managed to remain independent of the Ottomans all the way into this period we're talking about here. Now, all of these independent territories, though, became subject to European rule over the course of the 19th century, or at least by the early 20th century. The most obvious example is Algiers. As I said, the Deys of Algiers were great sponsors of piracy, and even under pressure by Europeans, they refused to try to bring this to heel. This is what served as an excuse for the French to invade Algeria in 1830, though this was partly part of the restoration of monarchy in France. This was a distraction from domestic policies, which were not so popular. The invasion of Algiers was quite popular with a large segment of the French population. And within just a few years, they had taken over all of the major cities of the coast. You can see up here Algiers itself, and over here in the west, Oran, and then over here, Bonnet. These are kind of the major cities of the coast. And this is all very fertile agricultural territory, and that's exactly what France wanted. And so they began to ship settlers, mostly peasant farmers, across the Mediterranean, giving them farms in Algiers, and protecting them with French troops. And over time, the population of the French people in Algeria grew to be quite large. By 1880, it was about 350,000. Most of these poor farmers And as it turned out, by the end of the 19th century, many of these farmers had actually moved into the cities because, one, the cities offered better protection, and two, the farms were often not that productive, and so they could find better economic opportunities in the towns. The resistance continued. The resistance to French rule continued, though, for many decades, all through the 19th century, really. Starting in the 1830s under the leadership of a guy named Abdelkader, who was the founder of a Sufi brotherhood, or rather this is named after him. I'm not sure exactly what role he played as founder or anything, but the Qadiriya brotherhood of Sufi warriors who did everything they could to attack French positions and try to harry the French in forcing them to leave Algiers. The French, of course, didn't leave, but this was a bellwether of what the French would face all the way into the 1960s when they would finally leave, and we'll talk about that, of course, in later classes. Even after suppressing Abdelkader and I think killing him in battle or arresting him, I forget which one it is, even after that, the resistance continued. Now, Tunis, seeing what had happened in Algeria, was desperate to keep the French out. Given the proximity of Tunis to Algiers, and Tunisia, as it came to be called, to Algeria, the people of Tunis desperately wanted to put off any French idea of just annexing this as well. And so in the 1830s and 1840s, they enacted a series of reforms. They cracked down on piracy. They began to secularize and modernize, largely after Western fashion, separating religion and the state apparatus and everything like that. And so they enacted a bunch of reforms. They also sought British protection, thinking that the British would help to prevent the French from taking over Tunisia. And this worked for a time, and Europeans were quite impressed with the Beys of Tunis and the reforms that they were making. However, largely due to internal European conflicts, the British eventually agreed to just get out of the way of the French, and by 1881, I should say, the French seized control of Tunis and made it a French colony. Now, they didn't annex it outright, but they did make it a colony. Now, the British and the French were also involved in the region around Tripoli, which was one of the major cities in what came to be called Libya. This area had thrived for centuries off of the trans-Saharan trade, the slave trade in particular, and the British sought intervention there to try to stop the flow of slaves. And it's here that one of the main fundamentalist groups begins, under the leadership of Muhammad al-Sanusi. In the 1840s, the Sanusiya order, the Sanusiya Brotherhood as it's called, had the joint purpose of imposing strict Sharia law on the society and fighting against any European incursions. And so this area was fraught for Europeans for quite a time, and the slave trade continued. Tripoli and the rest of that coast, Cyrenaica and all of those areas, would not be conquered and become a European possession until 1911, when Italy managed to defeat the remaining resistance forces and turn it into an Italian possession. However, the resistance among the Sanusiyas in the interior, down into the Fezzan region, continued. We find a similar story, though, with some differences over in Morocco. Again, this is an area that was never part of the Ottoman Empire. We have independent sultans, and they even sought to expand their reach to the south, down into the region that came to be called Mauritania, and succeeded in doing that in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. However, the Spanish, who are, of course, very close in proximity to Morocco, just across the Strait of Gibraltar, began to establish claims to land in the northern part of Morocco. They even seized control of some of the port cities the coastal cities in northern Morocco, and to try to put off any further Spanish expansion, the sultans of Morocco agreed to pay the Spanish essentially a large indemnity to just get them to leave. To do this, they took out a huge loan from the British, and this made them beholden to the British, and eventually both the Spanish and the British were putting pressure on them. Though the sultans really proved to be quite capable in heading off any outright annexation or imperialism, at least until 1912, when Morocco, by sort of joint agreement with among a variety of European nations, agreed to partition Morocco, or what had traditionally been part of the Sultanate of Morocco, into two parts, one controlled by the Spanish and one controlled by the French. Now, the case I want to spend the most time on here is Egypt. And this is demonstrative of a number of the themes that we're looking at here. Egypt, as I said, had been a key area of Ottoman influence, but let me get a drink. But over the course of the 18th century had become largely independent under the leadership of the Beys, this military aristocracy there. And the disunity and really the weakness of the Ottomans came to be fully on display in the late 18th century, the very last couple of years of the 18th century, with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. And this is really Napoleon's kickoff of his tremendously successful military and political career. This is where he made his name by taking a French army and invading Egypt and occupying the country for a time. It was only with British help that Ottoman forces were able to oust Napoleon and the French troops from Egypt in 1801. And Napoleon, of course, then took the success he had enjoyed in Egypt and gained a following among the French military and eventually became the Emperor of Western Europe. And so that exposed the weaknesses. The one who stepped into the breach to take over as the leader of Egypt was a guy who was originally from the Balkans, originally from Macedonia, though Muslim. He took the name Muhammad Ali, and also the title of Pasha, this was the title given to the viceroys who ruled these areas under the Ottomans. Though Muhammad Ali Pasha did not, technically all through his career he claimed to be only governing in the name of the Ottomans. He acted as a completely independent ruler of Egypt over his long career, his rule stretched really from 1805 to 1848 or 49 when he died. And so this is nearly a half century that he was in charge of Egypt. Muhammad Ali Pasha is perhaps the most important figure in all of 19th century North Africa. He was the one who tried to modernize Egypt. He was the one who, seeing the European model, seeing how they had industrialized, decided that he needed to depart from traditional Muslim structures and produce a modern society in Egypt. He did this through a variety of means. The main one was borrowing heavily from Europeans to fund his industrialization efforts, thinking that the industrial output would increase the economy and he'd be able to pay back the loans. That was, of course, a problem, and that indebtedness would, over the future generations, would become even more of a problem. He commanded the respect and the loyalty of a military bureaucracy, and ruled in military fashion, very much forcing through military means his reforms. He sent a lot of Egyptians off to Europe, to the universities in Europe to receive an education there, thinking that they could then come back and help with the modernization efforts. One of the main programs, actually, and this Muhammad Ali Pasha's strategy here was to sort of nationalize or take over. I don't want to use the word nationalize yet. That the nation really isn't the term we should be using, but to centralize the main money-making activity in Egypt, which was the growing of cotton. Egyptian cotton is very high quality stuff, all the way to the present, in fact, seen as some of the highest quality cotton in the world. The climate and the geography and everything is perfect for growing cotton in Egypt. And so he made this a state enterprise. In fact, he passed laws that forced farmers to grow cotton, and often administered the exporting of the cotton grown in Egypt, effectively producing what were state monopolies on the growing of cotton and on other the burgeoning industries that he was trying to establish there. Militarily, Muhammad Ali Pasha expanded, and he did this under the auspices, or rather with the excuse that he was doing this on behalf of the Ottomans, but really he was acting independently. One of his areas of expansion was into the south, into the region known as the Sudan, down into what is now the country of Sudan, and even along the Red Sea coast all the way down to Ethiopia. And we talked about this when we discussed Ethiopia. Said that they had come into conflict with Egypt in the early 19th century. Well, that's due to the expansion of Muhammad Ali Pasha. He seized for a time the important port on the Red Sea of Massawa, and was seen as a major threat by the Ethiopian emperors. He also, later in his career, attempted to expand his authority over the Levant region, the region now occupied by countries like Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria. And this was a direct challenge to the Ottomans, and it was obvious to everyone that that was the case. The Europeans, Western Europeans, the British and the French in particular, who had, due to the growing power on the one hand of well, mostly the growing power of the Russian Empire, they decided to prop up the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. The Ottomans were known in Western Europe as the sick man of Europe, this empire that was really failing. But they sent military expeditions to aid the Ottomans, and one of these was directed at Muhammad Ali Pasha, and so he was forced to withdraw from the Levant. And this was one of the things that led to the weakening of his hold on Egyptian politics and the Egyptian economy. Now his successors were left with this weakened position, really giving way not to the Ottomans, who really couldn't extend their authority much into Egypt, even if they had wanted to, and they probably did want to, but the influence of European powers, particularly the British, who were funding a lot of these modernization and industrialization efforts. The one who did experience some success was Muhammad Ali Pasha's grandson, who took the title of Khedive, which was an old Persian government title, and so he was trying to break himself away from anything to do with the Ottoman system, really. Khedive Ismail, as he was known, presided over an era of more modernization and more industrialization, but he did this through taking out huge amounts of debt, mostly to the British. One of his key successes was the Suez Canal. He was the ruler of Egypt during the time that the canal was built and finished in 1869. And the thought was that this would, and actually Muhammad Ali Pasha had opposed the building of a canal to connect the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, knowing that this would make it so that there was more European involvement there, and he wanted that to be on his terms rather than Europeans' terms. Well, Ismail was not, I guess, so astute to understand that that would be the case. By the end of his reign, in 1879, Egypt was completely crippled by the amount of debt to which they were beholden, to their European creditors. And after an attempt to seize power from this family, with the revolt in 1881 of a guy named Ahmad Arabi Pasha, The British had already begun to intervene in Egyptian affairs in 1879. They sent a guy named Charles Gordon to act as an advisor to the successor to Ismail. But after this revolt, Gordon recommended that the British just send troops and effectively take over Egypt entirely. And this revolt of Ahmad Arabi Pasha prompted that. In 1882, Britain effectively took control of Egypt. They established it as a protectorate. This was not a colony. Charles Gordon stayed on as the key advisor to the later Pashas of Egypt, but was effectively making all of the important decisions relative to the economy and the military and things like that. In one of the assigned readings, and I realized that I forgot to do this last time with the letter from King Moshoeshoe to what I forget the name of the British man he was corresponding with, but look over these documents, make sure that you're able to place them and draw from them in your discussion of these eras. But in this assigned reading, which is General Gordon, the Earl of Cromer, who was Gordon, that was his title. He became the Viceroy of Egypt. He talks about why Britain acquired Egypt here. And he says, historically the Egyptians have been ruled by other people. To have an independent Egypt really would be not a good thing. This would not certainly be not in the interests of the British. So he goes through this kind of recounting of history to say that Egypt has been ruled by Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Circassians, and Ottoman Turks. And so this is nothing new. We're not doing anything that's out of sort with precedent here. We need to be in control of this area because this is a very important location for us. We're worried about the expansion of the Russians. We need to be in a position of strength to help prop up the Ottomans. This is going to be good for us economically, right? And he concludes with this statement that English history affords other examples of the government and people of England drifting by accident into doing what was not only right, and so he saw this as a morally good thing that the British had done, but was also most in accordance with British interests, and that is definitely true. That this was very much in accordance with British interests. To have, for the most part, control over one of the most economically prosperous regions of all of Africa, and so the setting up of this protectorate in Egypt by the British was a key step in the growing imperialism, and this is right on the eve of the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, and kind of the scramble for Africa, and so it's an important event for those reasons too. Okay, so we'll move on and talk about Islam in West Africa and East Africa in the next lecture, and I'll discuss all of these issues with you on the discussion board as you see fit. Thank you very much.